Good evening, everybody. We're going to talk more about morality this evening. We haven't really even started about William's sort of take on this amoralist fellow. And before we get to even that material, I've got a bunch of other things I want to talk about with regard to morality. Um, one hanging thread from this morning's discussion had to do with the difference between or some stuff that's going on with the relationship between normative ethics and applied ethics. So, if you remember from this morning, moral philosophy is broken down largely into three categories: meta ethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. And to remind you about that, applied ethics is mostly focused around behavior. It's about specific things. So something like government policy, that would be applied ethics, or social issues like maybe something like abortion, whether abortion is morally permissible or not, that would be an applied ethics thing. Whether torture is sometimes justifiable, those are all topics in applied ethics. And normative ethics is mostly about the fundamental values and principles that give us guidance on what is moral. So kind of like the deepest roots of what is valuable that puts context for all of our other normative judgments. That if anything else is good or right, it's a derivative or an application of that more like general principle or deeper value. So, and taken together, there it is. Normative ethics and applied ethics will give you a kind of a substantial picture about what life should look like, what the ethical life is like. And meta ethics is kind of doing something a little bit different in that meta ethics is concerned predominantly about bigger questions that go beyond what the details of the moral life should look like. Like, what is a moral life in like abstract definition sort of thing? Or like I gave you guys a list this morning of some of the topics in meta ethics. Stuff like what does it mean to say something is good or bad or right or wrong? What is that about? What does it mean to say something is a duty or an obligation? Whether there is objective universal moral truth. And my personal favorite, the one that I think is probably the most significant question for us to get an answer on, um, what are the standards of rationality or justification for making normative claims of any kind, whether it's about behavior or values and principles? But meta ethics is kind of something a little bit apart from normative and applied ethics. There's kind of this little division to it, mostly because meta ethics won't give you any kind of answers about how you should live in detail, like where the rubber meets the road. It won't do that sort of thing. Um, it's kind of like the difference. It's actually very similar to the difference between, like, say, doing science and doing metaphysics about science. So, like, trying to understand what is the knowledge of reality that science is really getting us. That's kind of like meta ethics. Science is going to do its own thing, it's going to get its answers about what's the content of what we should believe. But what it all means, or what we're even talking about when we're doing science, that would be like a good analogy for what questions meta ethics is asking about all the rest of this stuff that's happening. Now, the hanging thread that I wanted to discuss is the relationship between these two things, normative ethics and applied ethics. So, I got coffee again tonight. Let's see if I don't manage to spill it all over my computer again. Ever since that night, my control button on the left side of my keyboard will just start spastically triggering. So I'm like typing, and then all of a sudden, all these control commands start happening. So I'm gonna have to rip it apart and clean it up. So dumb. Anyway, um, remember when I was talking about normative ethics, when I was first sort of framing our discussion of normative ethics, I was telling the story about like a kid asking questions. Why should I do this thing? Why should I do this thing? Why is that good? Why is that good? Keep digging it deeper and deeper. That kind of like natural inquiry and investigation into moral matters is kind of what prompts what is, I think, the most traditional way of thinking about getting to moral truth or building a moral theory. And that's what I might call the top-down theory. Philosophers throughout history have been like, okay, well, I say this thing is good, but why is it good? What's the basis or ground for its goodness? That's what's really important. Figuring out what that is. Like, what's the kind of fundamental ground that would make anything good? I think I need to figure that out first before I can figure out what particular behaviors to do. So, in other words, before I know how to act in a specific situation, I have to figure out what's kind of universally important first, because that is sort of the ground on which everything else gets its value. So, like, I drew that kind of pyramid picture for you guys before. And something like the chief good, or in Latin, the summum bonum, the ultimate end, that thing is going to be the reason why when I ask why is this good, it's because of this. Why is that good? Because of something else. A lot of times when we make judgments about goodness, it is some kind of contingent goodness. It's goodness that depends on something else being good. Like, well, okay, this is kind of a cynical example, but like, if you guys show up to class, like, why would you do that? I mean, it'd be really awesome if my students came to my class because they just wanted to come to class because they thought it was valuable for its own sake. But a lot of times there's other kind of ulterior motives in there. You like come to class so you can like get a good grade because your attendance credit is important for your grade. And why do you want a good grade? Well, so that you can like pass the class and do well there and graduate. And why do you want to graduate? So you can get a degree and so on and so forth. Like the things that we value for the sake of other things. And if we trace those lines of support back, eventually they're going to have to be grounded in something that is valuable for its own sake, and that's maybe kind of like the ultimate value. This is called top-down reasoning, or top-down moral theorizing, because I have to figure this out first. Oh, wow, I drew that one backwards. So I need to figure out this stuff first, and then I like trace the questions backward. Then when I figure it out, if I had any questions about what's going on down here, now I can just apply what I know is generally good and right into a specific case to figure out what to do. So it's kind of like if I'm faced with a moral dilemma, I have to make a decision, an ethical dilemma. I just have to make some decision about how to live. Should I do this or should I do that? I'll consult what are my ultimate values. What do I really care about deep down? And then see what kind of guidance that gives me into this particular situation. That'd be like top-down moral reasoning or moral theorizing. There's also something called a bottom-up strategy too. And this happens a lot in applied ethics because there's a lot of disagreement here at the level. I mean, there's a lot of disagreement in morality, period. If you want to study morality, you're going to be digging into controversy left and right no matter what. But applied ethics is like, do we have to resolve all these deep questions about ultimate values and principles in order to get straight on maybe what is the right behavior? Like maybe we don't have to answer all the deepest questions in order to get straight about some of these pressing issues that we have to make decisions about. So applied ethicists sometimes come up with other strategies or methodologies for how to get these moral answers. And one common strategy is bottom up. And applied ethicists will use top-down reasoning too. They'll be like, well, okay, which ethical theory is the right one? That's kind of still up for debate, but we know what a lot of the significant options are, and let's look at what all of them would have to say about this situation. And maybe that's kind of like revealing different parts of the moral landscape here that help us get an idea about, okay, maybe there's at least some consensus about this. Or trying to maybe we think all the different moral theories do give us certain parts of the ethical landscape that are important, like certain values that matter. And then maybe we can work out of all of the things that are morally relevant, in a particular situation, we can get some clear guidance about how to handle that situation, or how to make that choice. But even without consulting normative ethics, applied ethicists sometimes work this way. They might take a bunch of specific cases. So these are like discrete cases, not general, not abstract, not like values and principles, but like really grounded cases. And then they will consult intuition to see what our intuitions say about those cases. And the intuitions that they need to use this strategy have to be uncontroversial. If they're controversial, then that's not going to be clear guidance. But let's say we've got some clear, let me draw these a little differently. So we've got some moral cases, and then we consult our intuitions, and in maybe some cases, intuition says, yep, that's a good thing to do, or it's okay to do it. Other times we're like, not good to do that same behavior in this set of circumstances. Oh, it's good here, bad in those cases, and okay here. So after consulting intuitions, then the applied ethicist might try to formulate some general rule that will capture the moral intuitions. In other words, this principle or rule, when applied into those situations, will return judgments that match up with our intuitions. If it does that, then that means it's a good rule. But if it, say, gets some of these cases wrong, see how they're not matching up in some of those cases? Like, here it's not matching up, here it's not matching up, then that would be a reason to say it's a bad rule. So this would be a bottom-up strategy because we're first kind of getting straight on these particular cases and then using that as the argumentative basis or the evidence for justifying a more general rule or principle. So that's a little different from the top-down strategy. Which one is right and which one is wrong is another big can of worms. Maybe there are some concerns about both of them. You might have noticed that Williams, in his preface, is not completely enthusiastic about what moral theory can accomplish, and I'll actually talk about that a little bit. I got some fish to fry there, but these are two different ways that that philosophers morally reason in trying to resolve moral dilemmas. One thing maybe I'll point out about this sort of bottom-up strategy is that it is very dependent on intuition. It relies on granting some kind of moral authority to our intuitions, and there are some reasons for being skeptical about that or doubting our intuitions and the veracity of our intuitions. Most of the classical theorists, in fact, are pretty anti-intuitionist. Intuition's a little more popular these days. It's more contemporary philosophy is done off of intuition than some of the classical stuff. And whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, some things I'm torn on. I tend to be pretty anti-intuitionist myself as a moral philosopher, but that's neither here nor there. We could maybe talk about that more if you guys want to some other time. And actually, this thing about intuitions and say maybe our moral conscience, you might be heard that term before, having a moral conscience, will come up when we do the Nietzsche stuff too. So this stuff will come back. Okay, so I wanted to kind of say some things there about what moral theorizing can look like or how it can work. Let's go to some of Williams' general comments here about moral philosophy that are happening in the preface. I gave you the preface because I think there's some good ideas in there, some interesting comments by Williams that are worth pointing out. A couple of things he says I wish were taken more seriously, especially his comments here about how doing ethics is risky. I'm fond of saying that. Especially, I mean, all philosophy works this way, but especially moral philosophy, I like to say, is audacious. It's just audacious. It's crazy to try to come up with a theory that's going to explain what's universally and objectively good. That's big time. That's very ambitious in terms of trying to defend a position. And it's not like maybe we can opt out of that. That's actually going to be part of what Williams is going to explore. Is it possible to live life in a way where you're not invested or wrapped up in making moral claims and having that kind of audacity? But I think it is. Williams puts it this way. He says it's risky. It's risky to do ethics, and I think that's worth respecting. I don't think that there's a lot of easy moral reasoning that we do. Like, to put it kind of bluntly, I frequently encounter this opinion that, oh, morality is no big deal. I mean, it's just like, don't be a dick. Like, everyone knows what's right. It's like, don't screw with people. Don't harm them. But I think morality is a much more complicated sort of thing than that. There's a lot more room for disagreement and controversy than something like that. And one of the problems is that in kind of getting to better moral answers here, getting at maybe even moral truth, is thinking that we have all the answers already, and that we, like I was saying this morning, that we don't hold our moral beliefs with a lot of critical rigor. We don't feel the need to shoulder our burden of proof quite as heavily as when we make other types of claims. They're the kinds of things that we might take for granted. But Williams has a couple other reasons why he thinks that ethics should be considered a kind of risky field. One, he says, if you're wrong, if you're doing moral philosophy and you're wrong about it, then you run the risk of misleading people about matters of importance. In other words, let's say I write a philosophical paper about, I don't know, something like maybe personal identity or time or some other like metaphysical stuff, maybe the deeper analysis of what a cause is or something like that. If I get that wrong, it's not going to have a lot of disastrous effects. People aren't going to be, well, first of all, people are probably not going to be reading my book, or not a lot of them, and the chances are the people who are reading them are not going to be as easily fooled, or are going to be a little more critical in how they read it. So there's not a lot of risk of harm happening if I'm wrong, say about personal identity or something like that. But, and I'm not to say that there's no risk, but there's just a lot more risk if I'm doing some philosophy or making arguments about moral matters. Like if I convince people that something is moral and it's not moral, that's a big problem. Like I just made the world a worse place. So that's one reason why Williams thinks we should enter into moral theorizing very carefully and very respectfully, almost like it's like sacred or something like that. Maybe I'm throwing that in there. That Williams doesn't really use that kind of language, but he wants us to take this stuff seriously. He also says another distinct danger here, something that makes doing ethics risky, is that if I'm writing about ethics, I have a much greater chance of revealing to you the deepest, most intimate parts of what makes me what I am. And that means that if I'm wrong, there's a more distinct chance that I show myself to be a fool. So if I'm wrong about, say, a theory of time or something like that, it's like, well, that's difficult stuff. Okay, so your theory didn't turn out to be correct, or it was vulnerable to a massive objection. Okay, I mean, who's going to really matter? But if you write a paper about, like, what you think the meaning of life is all about, then if that's wrong, people are like, you're going to be way out there. You're like hanging all your laundry out there for people to look at when you're writing about moral philosophy, because morality, frankly, is one of the deepest things that makes us what we are, about all the aspects about us that make us unique people or personalities or stuff like that is wrapped up in a lot of ethical stuff. So when you're actually trying to like formulate it and put it out there and make it available to criticism, you're really making yourself available to criticism in a really profound way. That's one of the things I think is pretty cool about moral philosophy, and why if you can have charitable cooperative debate about it, it can be very intimacy building. It can be a very special type of thing to share with someone, to be able to do that kind of, to go to those places and to have those conversations. But that's another thing that Williams wants us to recognize about the territory, the philosophical territory that we're covering when we're doing ethics, that he thinks is significant. Here I got a question in the chat here. How does one define what is moral, though? Over the last 100 years, what is moral within the U.S. has changed significantly. Or, where do morals and popular opinion differ, since part of it might not truly be morals, but the opinion on them? Okay, the first thing I want to say about this question is this goes back to what I was talking about this morning about the philosophical study of morals is not cultural anthropology. It's not the study of just what people think is moral, or different conventions that have been held at different times in history or by different cultures or things like that. That's cultural anthropology, sociology, stuff like that. And that's just about descriptive claims. Remember, we were saying what makes ethics its own field is about normativity, that there's this totally different type of truth claim that we can make, and trying to sort out the truth of that is what ethics is about. So there isn't any kind of thing about, like, in other words, in order to defend a view in ethics, you don't actually have to interface with any culture whatsoever. Because a cultural thing is just like, this is what people have thought. That's no evidence about what's really right. It's very, very possible that people could have, on a mass scale, the wrong idea of what is the right way to live. Very, very, very possible. There's a lot of paradigms that kind of reflect that kind of opinion. A lot of them are religious, that human nature has maybe some like big fundamental moral blind spots to it. whether that's the ego or self-love or something like that. That there might be something that's kind of deep down in us, like seriously effed up. That might be the case. So we might not be able to trust anything about what human beings' opinions are about morality in order to figure out what's really right. But that might not mean that we don't have any way of getting in contact with objective moral truth either. Now, I don't want to kind of spin off here into giving a particular theory here about how you discover objective moral truth, other than to say that there are a lot of options out there. And I think, like I was saying this morning, sometimes if we're pessimistic or fatalistic about the chance of having a justification for what is objectively moral, a lot of that might just happen from not being aware of what are the strategies and options available for how you could actually defend what's universally and objectively true. I don't think it's an easy question to resolve by any stretch of the imagination, but it's something I think we can make some progress on. There's definitely room for reasoning about this. The same way that it's like, are we ever going to find out what is fundamentally why the laws of physics the way that they are? Probably not. It's not gonna happen. But we can make progress on that. We can be getting more of the picture. The same sort of thing can happen with morality too. Sometimes it's harder to figure out what counts as moral progress. And in fact, the notion itself of moral progress is a meta-ethical debate. So there's room there. I also want to say, in response to your questions here, Lawrence, that in order to get moving on any kind of inquiry within ethics, a lot of times philosophers do assume that there is objective moral truth. That is an assumption that is advanced without argument. It's not like every time someone wants to write a paper in ethics that they reinvent the wheel here about justifying why we should think that there's objective moral truth. But there are debates about that, whether that is the case or not. You guys saw some of it from the Williams-Nagel piece that we did. You know, remember Nagel is trying to vindicate our liberal values in the sense that we believe that people have fundamental human rights and stuff like that, that's the correct way to think about morality. He wanted to argue for that we have to be realists about that sort of thing. And that's very interesting and compelling. There will be a connection here with Williams about that. Like, if we're going to be fatalistic about there being objective moral truth, then the only alternative is to operate as if there is no moral truth. And is that even something that we can do? That would be like living like the amoralist. That's one of the threatening figures here for whether we can even move forward with a kind of vision of what is objective moral truth. The particular substance is of what we think is objectively right. But there is a lot of room for defending that claim that there is objective moral truth, and to pursue arguments to try to show what it actually in fact is, like what its actual content is. I think there has been a lot of progress in history on sorting out the options here and the objections and replies and arguments that can be offered. I feel like there's something else here I want to say too that's pretty important. Gosh, I feel I got this like feeling in the back of my head like there's a hanging thread here. But is that answering your questions, Lawrence? Say the large majority of moral philosophers believe in objective moral truth. There's not a lot of I don't know, disagreement about that. There, at least for most of the time, people are pretty happy being like, yeah, let's go with this. Let's see what we can do there. If there is no objective moral truth, then everything that we're doing is basically a big waste of time. That there's nothing to that. Oh, that's what it was. Going back to the Nagel piece. Like I said, there's going to be a little bit of connection here with Williams, but let's get some of Nagel back on the table, because that'll be like some good framing context here. Remember how Nagel said, if you wanted to write off objective moral truth, you'd need some grounds to do that. You'd have to show some grounds for skepticism, some grounds for making an objection, for having a fatalistic attitude about objective moral truth. And Nagel says the only way that you're going to actually be able to defend one of those kinds of relativistic reductions of moral truth to something that's not objectively true, but maybe it's just relativistically true, that will rely on more objective truth claims, and moreover, they'll be of the same type as what is being reduced in this relativistic analysis. So in other words, if I want to say that moral values are just social conventions and that's all there is to them and everyone just is biased, I'm actually going to be, in the process of defending that view, making my own type of objective moral truth claims. I'll be making normative claims about what is good and bad and right and wrong and what is significant and meaningful, in the process of trying to defeat objective truth. That'll get in there too. So what Nagel thinks is the only right way to respond to this situation is to sort of recognize that we have to move along in the same way. He's saying there's no other option here for them to just continue the way that we've been going, which in other words is to make objective moral truth claims, hold them critically accountable and test them and see what other options are out there. But the only way that the debate is going to move further is with more objective reasoning about morality. And so I think that's also a very useful part of the puzzle here. Yeah, okay, I'm going to save more until the time comes up in Williams that I want to come back to that idea, but we are going to go back there. Okay. So we just were talking about these sort of risks that Williams sees with doing ethical philosophy. And then immediately afterwards he says that most professional ethical philosophy completely avoids these risks, and that's not a good thing. They do it because they don't talk about anything interesting. He has a few different complaints about this. One of them is that they just engage in conventional moralizing. In other words, you build a big theory that's just reinforcing what people's intuitions already are. There's no kind of pardon me, I'm getting the hiccups. There's no pushing the envelope here on what our understanding of this moral dimension of this moral landscape is supposed to look like. We're not holding ourselves critically accountable or looking for controversy and those sorts of things. And I have to say, I've read a fair amount of moral philosophy that I think is guilty of what Williams is talking about. It's the kind of thing that I was very much encouraging you guys not to do for your own philosophy papers. Don't go for the low-hanging fruit. Don't try to defend a very trivial thesis. Try to find the stuff that's like really controversial and engage there. He also says that he feels like a lot of moral philosophy is just kind of leaving off. I guess this is kind of the same point or similar point here, just another way of attacking it. That it leaves all the important issues off the table, as he puts it. That all the real controversies are being ignored. And he also he has a more specific complaint too here. That I say more specific in the sense that it's got more particular philosophical commitments to it. But he also says that we don't discuss the things that are important to constructive moral reasoning. In other words, sometimes moral philosophers try to engage with ethics in a kind of clinical way. This connects with that point that Williams was making about preaching, that he was like, basically to summarize the point here, Williams thinks that a lot of moral philosophers feel like if they don't retain this kind of neutral, disinterested stance on how to engage in moral matters, that in some way they're guilty of preaching instead of philosophizing, that they're just kind of advocating for something and telling people what to do rather than engaged in serious inquiry over what is correct, what is true when it comes to moral things. Pardon me. And Williams says there's got to be some way that we can dig into the stuff that's like the most meaningful and rich about ethics and morality, the kinds of questions that keep us up at night without falling prey to just being preachy about stuff. Or in maybe some contemporary language, you might say, going on a rant. We don't want to go on rants. That's not useful or productive. We want to really systematically study and explore what could be the correct answer for how to figure out how to live our lives, like what is really valuable and significant and meaningful. And I think Williams is, Williams has shown up a couple times in the quarter, and part of that, is just because he talks about stuff in a more direct and accessible way that doesn't pull the punches on the philosophical content, and that's one of the things I really appreciate about him. But I think Williams gives you a good role model for what sincere philosophizing looks like, because a lot of philosophy can be kind of like dry and clinical, or where someone's not really ever putting themselves out there to be vulnerable, to like run the risk of making yourself look like a fool because you've just, aired out everything that's like your deepest commitments in how you live your life and what you just sincerely believe to be the most important. So I think that he's a good guy to look at for those sorts of things. I also want to speak really quickly here to what Williams has to say about moral theorizing. So one thing about Williams as a moral philosopher is that he's generally, I don't know, maybe he's kind of, I might say he's allergic to moral theory. And that he doesn't like systematic attempts to try to capture the entire domain of what the moral landscape looks like. In other words, he's not really keen on doing this sort of thing. He doesn't like doing this. Doesn't like that. He's more interested in this kind of stuff. The like messy details is kind of what Williams really enjoys, or what he thinks is meaningful. I had a instructor in grad school who was a particularist, and particularists believe that there are no moral generalizations that can be made whatsoever. That there is objective moral truth, and it is universal, but it's not general. It's always extremely specific to every situation. Like every moment is like an ethical microcosm that can't be related to anything else. No other situations. You can never argue from analogy in trying to morally reason. That's what a particularist believes. And this is in sharp contrast with a lot of moral theory. And gosh, I need to get some Kleenex or something for a eraser. But here's the contrast to that kind of position. And this is me kind of offering a little bit of my 2 cents here about mostly about why I want to kind of defend moral theorizing here. I am way on the opposite end of the spectrum here. I think that moral philosophy is very, very important to being able to respect what's going on in a specific situation. And let me just give you kind of a quick argument for how I look at it and why I think a lot of philosophers are drawn to this, especially a lot of the classical moral philosophers. Let's say you want to say that this situation, a certain action is morally permissible. That is, it's okay to do it. And in this situation, the same behavior is morally impermissible. So you want to say, whether the action is right or wrong, whether it's okay to do it or it's wrong to do it, depends in some way on the circumstances. There's something about this case that's different from this case. This one's green and this one's orange, or something. There's something that's supposed to be different here that makes the moral truth dependent on one thing versus another. But the risk here is that we're just making arbitrary judgments. That like we're Rob, this is not moral relativism. This is just saying that there are differences in the circumstances of these cases that are morally relevant. And we do stuff like this all the time. Let me give you kind of a toy example. We're totally going off book right now. This lecture is going to be a little long tonight, guys, because just because of some timing considerations with our schedule. And there's a lot of good stuff I want to get you guys. There's so many cool things to talk about with morality. This is a really cool one. Okay, so let's say let's have a case to talk about. Let's say the Utah Raptor and T-Rex are my students, and T-Rex comes to me and he's like, "Hey, I didn't get my paper turned in on time. Is it okay for me to get an extension?" And I'm like, "Sure, yeah, I'll give you an extension. You can turn in late, no penalty. That's cool." And then Utah Raptor's like, "Hey, I heard you're giving out paper extensions. Like, can I get one too? Because I didn't turn mine in on time." And I'm like, "Nope, no paper extension for you." What's the risk here? Risk is I'm just making arbitrary decisions. I'm holding double standards. I'm treating these people differently in a way that's unjustifiable. But there might be, so that's the danger. The danger is if we don't say anything more here, there's a distinct risk that hasn't been dealt with, that we might just be holding double standards and making arbitrary moral decisions, and that's no good. We don't want to be hypocrites here. That's a big no-no that I think everyone can agree to, that hypocrisy is bad. Whether it's a hypocrisy about descriptive judgments or about normative judgments, we don't want to contradict ourselves. That's bad. But so the way that I deal with the hypocrisy, the risk of hypocrisy, is to draw the line in the sand and say there's something about these circumstances that is different. For example, let's say you guys. I mean, this example doesn't work in some ways because I've been letting you guys turn in shit late, like left and right, and I don't really put conditions on it. But let's say I was a little more of a hard ass than I actually am. And I wanted to say, The reason T-Rex got an extension was because he was in a car accident and he was in a hospital when the due date was happening. When he was supposed to be like working on the paper to get it done in time, he was in the hospital and couldn't finish it up. So of course I'm going to give him. But what happened with Utah Raptor? Oh, he just went home and smoked a lot of weed and played Xbox and just forgot to do the paper, and that's why his was late. So maybe I'm like, that is not a justifiable excuse for getting an extension. There's something about the differences in these circumstances that's a morally relevant feature that makes it justifiable for me to have one judgment in one case and a different judgment in a different case. But again, there's a risk of hypocrisy here. In other words, the line that I draw in the sand has to be justified. It'll be described by a kind of rule, a rule that ranges over all of these cases and deals with them in the same way. So in other words, I got to find, if I'm going to make a judgment here and make a different judgment here, I need to be able to explain myself. And to explain myself, I need to say, here's what the judgment depended on. And whatever is that rule that I come up with, even though it applies in different ways into these two cases, I'm still treating all of the cases with the same standards. I'm using the same rules for everybody here. I'm not guilty of any double standards or any hypocrisy or anything arbitrary because I'm using the same rule in all of these cases. Are you guys okay with getting my voice? Anyone else having trouble? Okay. Anything that you missed there, Rob, that I can kind of get you? Okay. Okay. If there's something you missed, we can talk about it afterward. Okay, and even the rule, maybe the rule doesn't apply universally to all circumstances either. Maybe there is some line here where it's like, here the rule is appropriate, but over here the rule does not apply. But if that's going to be the case, then this dividing line in the sand needs to be justified with some more universal rule, and so on and so forth. So in other words, this is kind of like tracing the line of connection back to first principles. And I think there's a natural reason for it that propels us in that direction, and that is the concern about hypocrisy. Even the applied ethicist who's doing a bottom-up strategy wants to make sure that we have consistent rules here. And in that way, they are concerned about issues of generality that are more abstract and that are more theoretical. So that's a quick argument here for why contra Williams, there might be something to respect here about doing theorizing as a part of moral reasoning. Here's just one more thing I want to share. I think studying ethical theory helps increase your ability to understand a particular moral dilemma. I like to say that it increases your conceptual vocabulary. It's like it's giving you more lenses from which to look at a situation and try to spot what is morally relevant in that situation. I'd say most of us are moral people to some extent. And when we make moral mistakes, oftentimes it's in the name of something that really is a good value. It's just that we've got these other moral blind spots going on. There's other morally relevant features that we're not paying attention to. We have a very strong tendency, I think, in terms of our moral psychology for obsession about some particular values, and the focus that we put on those values is kind of diminishing our ability to recognize the other things that may matter in those circumstances. And that's what keeps us from figuring out what's really good. And moral theorizing kind of forces us to be accountable to some of these things. And I don't know, moral philosophers that give big picture moral theories oftentimes, I think, use ideas that you might find surprising or that you might not have thought of before on your own, that might be a little unfamiliar. And in that way, studying it enriches your toolbox of what concepts you have to work with in doing moral reasoning and analyzing a particular situation. Most of moral reasoning is not about understanding the facts of a situation, but it's thinking about the multiple perspectives that we have available for how we would attach significance to those details. And that's what we talk about as morally relevant. Like, it would be morally irrelevant for me to decide between which students I give extensions to and which ones don't based on like something like whether they're wearing hats or not. That's not a morally relevant feature. And to say that is to say something substantial. Okay, so that's some other stuff here. There. Oh gosh, man, there's just an endless string of things I want to talk about with you guys. I hope all these tangents aren't making things too bad or too hard to follow or too confusing. Are you guys doing all right in the chat? How are things? Let me check in with you guys. How are you guys doing? Any questions popping up? Okay, doesn't look like any. But if you got some, send them, and I'll take a time out to try to answer them. I think one thing that I'll use this as kind of a segue. One thing I think Williams is worried about when it comes to moral theorizing, like the theory component, is that we get more distracted by the needs and demands of our theories, like the rational standards that we hold our theories to, than to moral phenomenon itself. Like I think what one way I might try to articulate what I think Williams' concern here is that the intellectualizing might be a distraction away from listening to what is going on with this moral landscape. That I'm kind of I get taken off the path by following my own train of logic rather than opening myself up in this sort of. I think this listening thing is what he's really worried about, and that's a real risk. I mean, this is a risk about intellectualism generally. That the intellectualism can be done for its own sake, and we can lose sight of the real goal of why we care about making, say, a sophisticated perspective or theory or something like that. If we want sophistication in our theory, that has to be because what we're trying to understand is complex and sophisticated. And there's a lot of ins and outs, a lot of what have yous, that kind of stuff. So that the way Williams puts it is that our initial responsibility is always to moral phenomenon themselves, the kinds of stuff that impinges on our life directly. This is all kind of abstract language for it, but I'm wondering if you guys are getting the idea here. I wonder if there are some other words I can put to this. It's kind of like one of these professors at UW that I talked to one time. He's like, I really care about doing philosophy that matters. To not like just get wrapped up in these intellectual squabbles about hair-splitting distinctions and stuff like that. He's like, I want the philosophy I do to be something that answers the real pressing concerns that are ethical that face us in our lives. Like I think a lot of like if you're a young undergrad, then one of the most pressing ethical dilemmas that you're faced with, and it's one of the biggest questions that any human being can ask of themselves, is what I should do with my life. What's a meaningful way for me to live? I've got this whole life in front of me. What should I devote my energies to? What should I invest in? What should I make my life about? What values are going to ground the decisions that I make? What kind of meaning will that life have? There's a lot of options out there for you. That's a really pressing problem. And if moral philosophy is going to be doing something important, it's got to be able to be relevant for that kind of thing. It can't just be, cleaning up some side story stuff or sideshow stuff. We got to get to the main stage. And I think that's part of what Williams is concerned with. Okay, so that's all the preliminaries, and man, it's already been 45 minutes. But a lot of good stuff here that I'm talking about just kind of getting into this thing about doing moral philosophy generally. The more particular question that we've got from Williams that we want to address is this person called the amoralist. And the amoralist is kind of they're like a person that we can imagine, like a type of person, that their very being kind of presents a philosophical question, a philosophical dilemma. And that question is, why be moral? What's the point? And I wonder how you guys experience this reading, because you might feel that this is kind of like a silly question, that this is one of these irrelevant questions, that like, duh, morality matters, and if you don't care about morality, you're just a monster person or something like that. But remember what I was talking about with the acceptability principle and the code of intellectual conduct. I think sometimes it's very important for us to deal with the crazies, to confront those perspectives which seem just absurd almost. Because in having to give them an argument, we learn a little bit more about, even if we don't change our mind, like we get into that debate with them and we're like, yeah, I'm not convinced. I still think that there is good reason to be moral. By just having to face them in debate and give them arguments, we come to a deeper understanding about why we believe what we believe. And that's really crucial. I think it very much matters that we know on what grounds our beliefs are justified if we think they are justified. Because we can be wrong sometimes, but also we can have a kind of inauthentic relationship with it. I think a lot of times when people struggle with, say, moments of temptation, of weakness of will, or a crisis, a moral crisis, where they make wrong decisions, oftentimes I think it's because the person's moral character is not really founded on some kind of like solid foundation. If you really knew the arguments for why you're like, yeah, this is what's good, this is just these things that morality is talking about are the most important things in life for these reasons, and I might want to do these other things that please me or that I desire or that I crave or something like that, but I have the reasons why the moral values are more important than these other things that I might consider valuable. To have those answers, I think, kind of grounds you in following your principles a lot more than something like, oh, well, this is what society taught me, or like, this is what my parents taught me, or this is how they brought it up, or like, oh, there's a law here that tells me if I don't do it, I can get punished, or something like that. That can be a really, if you just take it for granted that your moral intuitions are correct, that could be pretty fragile ground to build a moral character off of. And that could be a concern, because then you aren't going to act in the way that you maybe in your more sincere moments think is objectively correct. So there's some things that are morally at stake there. And in terms of why we would ask this question, why be moral? I really like this question. I mean, obviously I put it in the class because I think it's important. It's an important question to face. I think it's not something we can just take for granted too, that morality just is right. Especially because there's a lot of different versions of morality out there. And some of them I think might be more justified than others on the grounds that they have more to say for themselves in terms of why those values are the ones that are appropriate, that they stand the test of criticism. And yeah, the amoralist, this person who thinks morality doesn't matter at all, that they see no reason why they should play by any of morality's rules or play this moral game at all, that's a pretty extreme but still potent threat to our way of life or something like that. That I think it's important to confront the demons, and the amoralist is one of those sorts of demons. Like, have you guys ever? Maybe you've had doubts about it. You're like, man, I know that this is the right thing to do, but is there even any moral truth at all? Like, maybe there isn't. Maybe this is just a big social construction, and there isn't any ultimate reason why I should do these things. It's just social conformity or something like that. That's a real threat to anyone who believes that morality is something real, that there's actually something going on here that matters. That those kinds of doubts need answers, and that's why we're getting into this discussion. So let's talk a little bit. The whole first part, I'd say a large majority of Williams' chapter, this piece of writing that Williams has, is just devoted to trying to figure out how to imagine what the amoralist is. I think it's from talking to people over the 30 some years that I've got on this planet. Most of the time when I see people being skeptical about morality, they're not really like the amoralist. They're not full-on skeptic about all of morality. They're just skeptical about a particular type of morality, like a particular moral code or some particular moral values and principles that then they just label as morality rather than kind of this program or this way of thinking, this distinctly moral character to how I think about what to do, how I make the decisions in my life. I think most of the time if you analyze the grounds for complaint that you have against morality, you'll catch yourself making moral claims, actually. And that's part of what Williams explores here in trying to track down what the amoralist is. The first distinction he makes here about who we might imagine as the amoralist is this distinction between someone who's just kind of in the throes of despair, that they're kind of like toying with nihilism, the belief that nothing matters at all, that there's this like hopelessness of that there's anything valuable or important or meaningful in life, period. And Williams has an interesting response for these people. He says they're not really that much of a threat to the rationality of morality, because he says these people don't need arguments. It's not there's not a flaw in their thinking here. It's not like they're reasoning in the wrong sort of way. The problem is that they need help. They have other types of issues that are not going to be solved with reasons. And I think that there's something to that. I think that Williams is right that some of the thoughts and concerns that we have about morality don't stem from rational considerations, but they stem from maybe other factors, sometimes emotional or psychological factors here. That like despair is not just a rational pit that I've dug for myself or something like that, but it has other factors going on. And if someone gave me what is a compelling argument for why life does have meaning, that wouldn't necessarily help me get out of despair and hopelessness. The thing that I think Williams kind of sells short on this is that there might be some rational reasons for despair. And in fact, there are some pretty prominent moral philosophers in the history of philosophy that have thought as much and have required an argument and have given some arguments to try to respond to that. Kierkegaard is one that comes to mind as one of, I think, the most significant that does this. And I think that there's something valuable to even considering that. But that's not what Williams is going to do. He's not going to focus on that person. So, but we can flag that for later conversation. But Williams wants to focus on a person who, as he says, puts a more defiant tone here in rejecting moral oughts. In other words, moral obligations or moral rules, things like that. Sorry, my back is still hurting, so I need to stretch it a little bit, and I'll be back here with the lecture in a second. So when we're imagining the amoralist, we're not imagining someone who doesn't care about anything at all, period. The amoralist has cares. They have preferences. In other words, they're not in a situation where they don't believe that there's any way to make choices at all. It's like, there's choices I can make. There's reasons I have for acting. Like, I'm not going to jump off the roof because I'll probably die, and that would be bad, and I don't want to do that. So they make judgments about value, but they don't make moral judgments. In other words, there's a difference here between saying something is good and bad and saying something is morally valuable, or that there's something that's morally right or wrong to do. These are actually two different aspects of normativity, and they work a little differently. So what the amoralist does is that they say the kinds of considerations that I'm going to use in order to make judgments about what I should do, how I make decisions about how to act in life, don't have anything to do with moral reasoning. What morality says is right and wrong makes no difference, makes no influence on how I'm going to act, what decisions I'm going to make. That's the amoralist here. So there's certain types of, the way Williams puts it, he says, okay, so they can't reason with moral principles. They're not going to do that. They're going to be like 10 Commandments. Okay, that's right out. They can't reason with something like that. There's also, he thinks, certain motivations that are unavailable to them. In other words, the amoralist, just in virtue of being the amoralist, can't be too concerned about things like promise making and promise keeping. That if they're motivated to keep promises or think that it's wrong if a promise has been broken, they probably can't have those kinds of thoughts, because that seems to be directly in line with some sort of moral principle. Something like a principle that tells me about what I ought to do, what I'm obligated to do. Now we're getting into moral territory when we're thinking that way. When it's saying like that it's not just a matter of what I care about. That's the key here for imagining the amoralist. All of their decisions have to come back to just their preferences and nothing more. It's got to be really thin here in terms of where their motivation comes from. They also can't do things like reason about what would be universally correct. As soon as you start talking about like what's universally right, Now we're also kind of getting into moral territory about what is universally appropriate. Um, he can't say something like, well, it's okay for me to do this because other people do it too, or something like that. That even would be moral reasoning, because you're talking about, when you're saying it's okay for me to do something, it's just okay. What that could be kind of, and put it, the moral baggage here conceptually that might be going on with saying something is okay to do is to say it's morally permissible to do it. In other words, this action is within the boundaries of my obligations. To do this action is not transgressing one of my obligations, making the action thus impermissible. It's morally allowed. And the amoralist can't be reasoning that way. The only way they can say it's okay to do it is that it's like there's no standards about what you cannot do. And here's another, actually, to just show just how extreme the amoralist is. Someone who's like trying to live life without playing the moral game whatsoever. They can't even be an anarchist. An anarchist, if we like want to talk about that as like a moral anarchist, not a political anarchist, but like a moral anarchist, that would be a person who says everything is permissible. There are no objective rules here about what you can and cannot do. Everything is permissible. That's a particular moral perspective. To deny that there are moral obligations is kind of a moral claim. To say everything is morally permissible is a kind of moral perspective. The amoralist has to do something like, whether something is permissible or not is irrelevant for whether I'm going to do it. That is more like the amoralist. Like, it doesn't matter what are the boundaries of permissible and impermissible actions. Even if everything is permissible, I don't even care about that. That's an irrelevant consideration for me making decisions about how I want to live. Okay. Here's another important thing that Williams says about how we have to imagine the amoralist. There's a pretty famous paper that came out in the 80s on the subject of moral psychology, talking about what are some of the like fundamentally moral attitudes. Like it's kind of like how Williams is trying to track down here what makes a kind of reasoning about how to act moral versus amoral. And one of these factors that's very inspired from this paper is that one of the essential aspects of like a moral attitude is something like resentment. So let's say someone does something wrong to you. If you're like sad about it or something like that, you can be sad about that. Someone did something to you and it was bad and harmful, made things inconvenient for you in some way, hurt you in some way. You can be sad about that without making a moral judgment. You could just say, that was bad. Just a bad thing happened. But if you hold it against the person, and like having the attitude of resentment, where you're like, I can't believe you did that. Like, oh my God. Now you're morally reasoning. Like, just that attitude right there is part and parcel of the moral stance. Like, thinking about things from a moral perspective involves taking on those kinds of attitudes and a willingness to do that. Even if we'd say, like, well, resentment is like a destructive, like negative emotion or something like that. Like, no one wants to be resentful. It's kind of like a poison in your heart, that sort of thing. There still is, you don't have to take it maybe as far as those more extreme ways of imagining resentment. But still, if you think, hey, this matters. Like, there's something here. It's not no big deal or something. Like, let's say your friend betrays you. They like do something that harms you deliberately. Then you can't just be like, oh, well, just a bad thing happened. If that's your kind of attitude, then in some ways it might say, like, do you really even care about the relationship? Like, is that something that's even meaningful to you if it's like, yeah, whatever happens, bad thing, sad it happened, but, I'm not too concerned about it. I mean, in other words, even if you think that certain moral attitudes, like, say, a willingness for forgiveness or a commitment to compassion and love, are like the most important things about how we should live, that's like the best way to live. Still, those kinds of things only really get the meaning that they do because of the realities about the possibility for resentment. In other words, there can't be apology and forgiveness if there's not a recognition of something's gone wrong morally. If that was not right for you to do that. There has to be that in place in order for that to happen. So the amoralist, when we're trying to imagine someone who's not playing the moral game, they can't take any of these kinds of attitudes. They can't hold grudges. They can't be resentful or anything like that. Let's say, like later on, Williams describes the amoralist, like to get an example of them, as like some kind of like gangster movie. And the gangster can be like, you know what? It's personal. This guy, but like, did this thing like before we were collaborating. Now we're not collaborating, so I'm gonna like single him out for doing bad things. Like I might try to kill all of his people or something like that. Like in this gangster movie situation, that's capable of being amoral. That there could be no moral baggage to that decision. If it's just something like eliminating the competition, or this person's a threat to my power now, or something like that, those are amoral considerations. Like I'm gonna get back at this person only because it's in my best interest to do so, something like that. But if the amoralist is like resentful of that person and is like wants revenge or something like that, I mean, revenge is a little dicey. Whether revenge is moralistic or not, maybe we could have a little bit of debate about that. But you can imagine some of their attitudes here turning into a moral sort of thing, like a kind of feeling of self-righteousness. That's definitely going to be playing a moral game here. So the amoralist can't be any of those things. It's kind of hard to figure out what they can be. Everything has to come down to just sort of their preferences, what they like, what they don't like, and that's it. That's all there is to it. Okay. Now let's start talking about imagining the amoralist and their relationship with the rest of society. This is kicked off when William starts talking about how the amoralist is like a parasite. What he means by that is that the only way the amoralist is capable of living the life that they're doing and making the decisions that they're doing is because nobody else is doing anything differently. Like everyone else is generally playing by moral rules, and that's what allows the amoralist to kind of get away with the crap that they're doing. That if everyone was amoral, then society would kind of fall apart. And you know, when I ask my students historically, like, why do you think we should be moral? Usually, like, what's the positive argument here for why be moral? What's the answer to that question? One of the first answers I usually get, and definitely one of the most common answers, is, well, without morality, society would fall apart. And the amoralist is not going to be very impressed by that argument because they're going to be like, why should I care about society? I don't care. I don't care what happens in society. Maybe if you guys stopped acting morally, well, I'd be like, that's inconvenient. Now I can't do as much of what I wanted to do to like just act on self-interest and selfishness and stuff like that, or to pursue whatever projects and goals and preferences I have for myself. But I don't see any force of obligation of something I owe to society. And I think that's a significant point here, that response kind of doesn't get at the really core motivation that we're looking for, a core response that we'd want for a defense of morality itself and why there's reason to be moral. Also, the other thing I think that's worth pointing out is that even if we think without morality, society would fall apart, that doesn't mean so. Like there's kind of this positive benefit to morality in that it's going to have this kind of good consequence. That on its own may not be the grounds of justification for morality. That might be just kind of like a positive side effect, not the most deepest and most meaningful reason about why morality matters. I mean, if you just thought that morality mattered in order to make sure society doesn't fall apart, I mean, how much investment do you have in that? In some ways, it's kind of a depressing thought because you're like, I have to do what's right just so that I can be a cog in this machine to make everything else run smoothly for people and be convenient. I mean, that's not very compelling as a source of meaning. You're like, oh, I see myself as just this cog in the machine sort of thing. There could be some concerns about that. I think there's other ways in which, like thinking about contributing to society in the sense of good citizenship can be deeply meaningful. If you've got some way to give a moral account for why sacrifice for others is important and why that matters, now that could be pretty deep. That could be maybe something to build a life around, a life of service. But let's not pursue that rabbit hole any further. Let's keep going here. So the amoralist is not going to be too impressed with the consideration that they owe something to society. And here's where we get into some other interesting claims about how to just think about what makes the amoralist what they are. Williams kind of goes on this extended exploration about how the amoralist might look at the rest of society, because they're definitely doing something countercultural, right? By just by saying, hey, I don't care about morality and how I live. Like, screw morality. They're definitely doing something that is going to go against a lot of social conventions, pretty much wherever you go. Any cultural community you show up in, amoralism is not considered a like viable option for living in most places. Um, so why would they maybe try to justify this, or how would they look at themselves in contrast with the rest of society? I think Williams points out a lot of interesting things about this. So in other words, sometimes I have met people like this who kind of wear it as a badge of pride that they are not drinking the Kool-Aid of doing what society says is right. That they like reject morality as like an extreme expression of counterculturalism. That they're like they're disillusioned with moral values. That morality is just for the sheep, that kind of thing, and that anyone who has strong moral character or who has any kind of like inspiration or ambition to greatness isn't going to really buy this whole thing about how you have moral obligations to other people and stuff like that. So they might think of themselves, as Williams puts it, as rather splendid in comparison with most people, the people who subscribe to morality. And Williams says they can't really do that. If they do that, they're going to start playing another moral game. They're basically saying that these are the ideals and values that are really meaningful and that matter in life, and that's why I'm better than they are. That's a kind of moral evaluation. So in other words, the amoralist in this sort of scenario wouldn't really be the amoralist. They would just be a kind of moral deviant. In other words, they're still playing by the game of morality. They just disagree with most of the rest of society about what the moral values are. And at that point, it's just going to be a debate between these different perspectives about what's truly the most meaningful values. Like, why might the general morality of the culture be objectionable? Like, what are the moral concerns here? What moral values are at stake with that? Why might it be right to live this other sort of life? What are the reasons that you want to abandon conventional morality here? And then that's just a moral debate, and we can, there's controversies there, there's uncertainties, there's questions, but we can do something about that. We can. There's not the same fundamental question about like how do we proceed that we have with the genuine amoralist. That's like, I don't even care about morality. So you can make all the moral arguments you want to. It's irrelevant to me. That's what the amoralist does. The other thing that Williams kind of follows here as kind of a tangent is that the other reason why the amoralist or just anyone can't see themselves as really somehow courageous for doing the kinds of selfish actions that everyone is afraid of, because it's not just that people aren't just moral because they're afraid of punishment. Is that a motivator? For some people, yeah. But there's a lot of people who also, Williams says, have like a kind of genuine commitment or investment in being moral. They don't just act morally because they're too chicken shit to do anything else. They like actively choose and commit to this kind of way of life. They think this way of life is important and meaningful. And here, maybe the amoralist or this other moral critic, let's call them the moral critic, that's probably more accurate here, might say, well, that's just social conditioning. Like, the people who really buy into morality are just drinking the Kool-Aid. They're just deceived and deluded that they're getting at something that's objectively morally correct, that there's this objective moral truth to it, because of these influences from society. And Williams has, again, a very interesting response. I like these different moves that he makes, the way that he tackles some of these big threats. These are kind of like the kinds of reductive arguments that Nagel was talking about with the relativist in that paper we had from Williams and Nagel. He says, like, this is an interesting point. He says, well, look at a lot of aspects of life. Like, my ability to do math or to even speak a language is socially conditioned. Like, those forces are a part of that. And in many cases, we don't think there's anything particularly problematic about that. So if you want to make an argument here for, like, why social conditioning is having some undue force in the case of moral judgments, then you got to make a case for that. And chances are you're going to be making moral judgments when you're doing that. And that way, the person who's offering this kind of argument couldn't make arguments and still be the amoralist about this. They would be kind of wrapped back into playing the moral game of some kind. But there's another one, another kind of connection here that's also connected with these lifeboat cases that Williams talks about. That maybe this whole social conditioning is just kind of an artificial way of covering up humanity's basic deep down nature. That, like, fundamentally, human nature is amoral, that it doesn't give a crap about morality, and that moral conventions are kind of like an artificial construct that society invented to kind of like hide from our basic nature, and that our most authentic selves are our amoral selves. That there's maybe from there it's something like that's our like deepest expression of freedom is when we're not holding our choices captive to moral obligations or something like that. And I love Williams' responses here. I think it's very, very interesting. He says, why would such cases matter? Wait, I'm sorry, I'm missing a link here for you guys. So why would we think that human nature is fundamentally amoral? Well, there needs to be an argument for that. We've got to have some evidence for that. And maybe there are these cases, like these lifeboat cases, like in extreme circumstances, like in a post-apocalyptic Mad Max setting, or zombie apocalypse, or desert island scenarios, or these lifeboat situations where people are like on a lifeboat and they're running out of food and water, and there's only so much for everybody. Like, how do people respond in those cases if their moral conventions kind of go out the window and they start acting amorally? What does this tell us? The temptation might be to think that, like, now you see what's really going on. Now, once you remove all the trappings of society and everything like that, now true human nature shines through here. That people really don't care about this stuff. That it's just this kind of fundamental amoral, selfish type of living. That no one really gives a crap about morality, ultimately. That we only care about morality. Maybe we'll play lip service to it when it's convenient for us. But when it's not convenient, then all bets are off. Fuck it. We're not going to care about morality anymore. That's the kind of temptation here of this line of reasoning. And Williams' response here is like, why are these the cases that we're going to treat as authoritative and significant in trying to test what human nature really is? In other words, when we're trying to figure out what an animal's nature is, we don't submit it to the most extreme sets of circumstances to try to figure out what its normal behavior is. That's just not the right way to look at it. We look at it under normal conditions, see what functioning is happening when it's not going horribly wrong. Like, if I wanted to figure out what is the like basic, most essential functions of my computer, I'm not going to test that under circumstances where I've submerged it in water. That's not going to be the best way to look at it. So in extreme heat or extreme cold or something. That's not how I'm going to set my benchmarks for how I understand my computer's behavior. Maybe the same thing is true with humanity. That what is sort of the normal setting is these sorts of normal conditions where maybe I sometimes am faced with dilemmas about how to meet my basic needs, but in other ways, there are avenues available for me to do that. I've got different options here about what to prioritize, whether I do want to care about other people or not. There's like room for that. Now what do I choose under those circumstances? And there's a quote from Williams I want to read to you guys here. Williams says, if there is such a thing as what people, I'm substituting the gender pronouns here. If there is such a thing as what people are really like, it may be that it's not so different from what they are actually like. And he means actually in a certain way of just like the way people are in day-to-day life that you are familiar with. That is, that what people are actually like, that is, okay, let me start over the quote, and then we lost context here. If there's such a thing as what people are really like, it may be that it's not so different from what they're actually like. That is, creatures in whose lives moral considerations play an important, formative, but often insecure role. That's probably human nature. That we care about morality, it's built into how we live, but we don't always follow it. Sometimes we are tempted away from it. That's what people seem to be like. Maybe that's human nature. It's not that it has nothing to do with morality whatsoever, but there are cases in which we succumb to temptation, where we prioritize self-interest over moral obligation or something like that. Okay, so this is sort of putting a picture together of yeah, okay, okay, we covered that. I think okay. There's some other things I want to talk about, but I think we're good. I want to move on. So this is all just putting a picture together of what the amoralist is like. What kind of person are we supposed to be imagining here? What kind of alternative form of life might I be thinking is the right idea for how I should live? Maybe I should give up playing this whole moral game thing and live like the amoralist does. So now we got a better idea. It's like living the amoralist life is living a life that's completely governed by my preferences and the things that I kind of naturally care about, without thinking of myself as beholden to any standards for conduct that extend outside of my own preferences and my own reasons, and maybe something like judgments about how the physical world works descriptively, so descriptive truth issues. Okay? But nothing more here. There's nothing that my judgments of value are ultimately accountable to. That's what the amoralist believes. Okay, so now in giving a response to the amoralist, I'm gonna try to do this quickly, guys. We're at an hour and 15 minutes here on the lecture, and maybe for our code, let me give you the code here. I'm gonna try to finish up the lecture in another 15 minutes here, so it doesn't go super long. It's a long one tonight, but I think I can get everything done in another 15 minutes. Our code tonight, let's have it be greed is good from Wall Street, because what's his name? That GG guy. I forget his name. Ugh. But the main character from Wall Street is like kind of a classic amoralist character. Just doesn't care about morality at all. Doesn't think in terms of morality. And a famous phrase from him is greed is good. So that's our code word for tonight. Greed is good. Okay, let's see if I can do this. In trying to give a response to the amoralist, Williams wants to first kind of ask a question about them. He's like, does our amoralist care about anybody? Does he care about any person? Does he have any concerns? In other words, do his preferences contain anything that refers to other people? Not asking, does the amoralist have moral compassion or something like that, like thinks that there are moral rights for other people, something like that. But just, do they have any desires and preferences that have to do with other people? If they don't have that, then Williams thinks that they're basically a psychopath or maybe a sociopath. Those terms are actually not very precise terms. Different people in philosophy and psychology use those terms to mean different things. We might say that they lack all feeling, that they maybe don't have any kind of emotional responses whatsoever about people when it comes to like people and how they interact with people, like human relationships and stuff like that. That to the psychopath, a person is just another machine that's running around reality, and something you have to negotiate in terms of like figuring out how you're going to do things, like how if I don't eat for a day, I'm not going to have a lot of energy. I got to negotiate that reality, and I have to recognize that if I do certain actions, like certain people are going to respond in certain causal ways that might get in the way of what I want. I mean, that's the kind of reasoning that Williams would describe as sociopathic, or I guess he uses the word psychopathic. And Williams kind of dismisses this alternative because he says this person is not a real alternative to us. There's nothing really compelling about the psychopath to me. If I'm trying to decide, should I live a life that has to do with moral considerations or not? Should I use moral reasoning to make decisions about how to live? The psychopath is not really the alternative that I'm imagining. If I'm not going to do morality, what am I going to do? Be a psychopath? No, I can't imagine that. Williams thinks for most of us, this is just not a type of living. This is not a real alternative. It's not something we could really choose because our psychological natures are just going to automatically get us to be concerned about other people, that we will have emotional responses to this stuff. Again, I think this is a little controversial. Whether because of a person's psychological condition, like lacking some of these effective emotional capacities, that they are unable to think about or be concerned about or value other people. I'm not so convinced that that's true. There's some case examples of people that are generally considered as sociopaths and that they're lacking these effective commitments, but they at the same time care about people. They live principled lives about making things happen that they judge to be good for other people. So maybe that kind of thing is possible. But let's kind of go with Williams here on this for now. Let's grant it for the sake of argument. Let's hear what he has to say about, and you'll see like why this move might be controversial. But let's kind of grant it for the sake of argument right now, and talk about the other option, which is the one that Williams spends more time on. Okay, so let's say the amoralist does care about other people. And by care here, we mean they just have preferences. Like the example he gave is this like amoral hero in like a gangster movie that they have no compunctions about killing people on a mass level. They don't think that they're doing it for some worthy cause or fighting evil or anything like that. They're just living a very selfish life. But at the same point, they're like, maybe they're concerned about their mother, or he says their mistress, or something like that. So there's some people, or a child, they've got some concern for these other people, but it really just stems from their own like self-concern. So it starts from them. It's like, imagine like a narcissist. Narcissists can care about people. They have a hard time caring authentically about people for their own sake, but they can care about people as like proxies for themselves. Like it's because they have invested this concern in the person. That's why they think of that, what happens to that person, as valuable, as like relevant for how they're going to make decisions. They don't think of it in moral terms. In other words, that this person is deserving of my care and concern. That's the moral thinking. This is just like, I invest in this person. Like, I invest in this model train that I built, or something like that. Like, amoralists can have projects where they care about something and value something. Okay. And Williams makes a very, very interesting point about the content of these desires. Like I was just talking about how they stem from, maybe they start with a kind of selfishness, that they are they're the only reason why the amoralist does get concerned with this other person in their life is only because of their own choice of valuing, their own preferences. That's the only thing that it's built on, not some kind of objective universal moral principle. But Williams says the content of that desire doesn't have anything to do with pointing at themselves. So in other words, this motivation that we can ascribe to the amoralist without turning them into the moralist still has this very interesting character to it, in that it's like, let's say this gangster fellow, their like child is in trouble. They've been like kidnapped by other bad people that are maybe going to harm them or torture them or something like that. And the amoralist is like, not cool. I want to save them because I'm invested in this person. I care about them. Not because it's like morally right or something like that, or those people are evil. None of those moral stories are happening in their head. But when they think about that, the child, for example, in this example, they're not thinking, this person is in need and I care about them, so I'm going to help. That's not how they reason, Williams claims. He thinks psychologically what's going on here is just that person needs help, so I'm going to help them. That's it. It doesn't have that extra moral content of that person needs help, and there's a moral principle that says you should help people when they're in need, so I will do it. Or like, this person is my child, so I have a moral responsibility to care for my child. None of those stories are happening. But it still has this character of just, person's in need, so I'm going to do something about it. That's what Williams says. Okay? This is a quote from Williams. He says, the thought is, they need help. Not the thought, I like them and they need help. It's not something like that. Even if causally, that's the only reason why they're concerned. Okay? There's a distinction here that's going on that I think is a very, very significant one. I've actually used this quite a bit in my own moral philosophy that I've been constructing, and it's generally important in talking about ethical egoism and psychological egoism, the belief that everything that we do is from selfish motives. There's a difference between the causal mechanism of a motive I have and the content of that mechanism. Let me say that again. There's a distinction here between the causal mechanism of why I have a certain motive and the content of that motive. Like what my desire is about. What object of value is it aiming at? Is it representing as being good? So, in other words, the mere fact that I only ever act on motives that are mine does not mean that my actions are selfish. Not in any meaningful sense of selfish. When we're talking about selfish, we're really talking about a difference in the content of my desires. Are all of my desires referencing me? Is everything that I do always for the purpose of helping myself? Or are some of my desires taking other people and what happens to them as the object of concern? So the mere fact that I only ever act on my motives and not your motives, like we're not telepathic or something. I don't act on your motives. I only act on motives that are within my psyche. That doesn't mean that all of my motives have myself as the object of concern. And that's kind of what Williams is exploiting here. He's saying even if the causal origin of the amoralist concern for their child is really just has to do with themselves and their own preferences, doesn't have any kind of other moral concerns, that doesn't mean that the content of their desire is self-referential, that it has to do with them. And the significance of this is that Williams thinks the fact that this is true, that the object of concern is just the person for their own sake, with no reference to self-interest or something like that, that gets the foot in the door for starting to develop moral motivation. Williams isn't going to say that this kind of like just preference that the amoralist has for, say, their child constitutes a moral judgment or moral behavior. But he thinks it's the psychological building blocks that are required for something that is a genuine moral thought, as he puts it. So, in other words, all Williams thinks needs to happen in order for someone to move from being the amoralist to being the moralist is to just sort of extend the things that they already care about. To like recognize that if they care about their child, if they think their child being in need is all that's required in order to justify care and concern, then what's different about other people? Why not people that aren't their children? Maybe that has a consideration too. And if that circle of concern is widening, at some point it's starting to get a little more universal, and now we're starting to have a genuine moral thought. That like I'm thinking about things as like what's generally good and meaningful, and not just what is meaningful for me. That kind of, in other words, Williams is not thinking that what they need is some kind of theoretical argument. He thinks what needs to happen is they need to expand their sphere of concern, the things that they're willing to be invested in. And as soon as they start moving that circle of concern out, a very natural move is going to be to now start doing the things that someone who genuinely is concerned about morality is going to be caring about. Those kinds of patterns of reasoning. The most I'd say controversial philosophical move that Williams is making is saying that there isn't a categorical difference really between non-moral motives and moral motives. That it's really just moving along a spectrum rather than having to do something that's totally different. Now, we had to be very careful to make sure that the amoralist was not doing these moral games, to make sure that they were a genuine amoralist. But Williams is fundamentally saying that there isn't some like crucial click where they go from amoral to moral. That in other words, the amoralist is fundamentally the same type of human being as moral people, as someone who is moral. I guess I'm pointing to myself. I think I'm a moral person. I'm very morally interested, and I think about moral matters in making decisions about how to live. So yeah, I guess I am a moralist. I would defend that. So that's interesting. I think there is a concern here about Williams' answer. It's a very interesting suggestion to say it's maybe not going to come down to something rational. That it's more like if you want to do moral education, you're not going to argue to people. You're just going to put them in situations that encourage them to develop their sympathies, of expand their sphere of concern, something like that. But at the same time, I think maybe this answer is not fully satisfying to the amoralist. That they could maybe ask the question, why should I expand my sympathies? Why does that matter? So in some ways, I'm not totally sold here on Williams's response to the amoralist, about whether he's really given a satisfactory answer and settled the issue, so to speak. And I think there's more to be done on this question. Um, what I really like about Williams is that he does show a sensitivity here to the stuff that is really psychologically salient about thinking about the amoralist life. Like really taking seriously this as an alternative rather than just dismissing it out of hand because like duh morality matters. Like of course it matters. Being like, let's really try to imagine this. What would this life look like? What would it be like to be the amoralist? And why might that be compelling? What kinds of stories could the amoralist tell about themselves that makes them think that this is a good idea? And there's more stories than the ones that Williams considered too. There are other things to talk about here. I've made responding to the amoralist and to the egoist um, one of the most like central success conditions for putting together a good ethical theory. That if you can give an answer for why be moral, that doesn't beg the question here, that doesn't just assume the value of morality, that's one of the things that we need out of a good moral theory. It's got to be able to pass the egoist test. And maybe when we get together again on Wednesday, I want to ask you guys. We don't have a lot of time left in the class, but maybe I do. Oh, man, it'd just be so cool to have a little bit of class discussion here about why you guys think. What would you say to the amoralist? What would you say to the egoist? To the person who's like, yeah, morality doesn't really matter. What sort of reasons do you have? Why do you authentically choose to engage in moral reasoning? And I want to say one last thing here before I let you guys go. We're at the hour and a half mark, so I'm going to sign off here. I promise. But um, I think it's important to kind of confront yourself with this. Like, why do you choose to live morally? Why do you endorse moral concepts as relevant for decision making? That's the question. But asking that question doesn't necessarily mean, or it's not intended to be like, maybe that amoralism thing is a good idea. I want to just kind of remind you of that thing I was talking about at the beginning of the lecture tonight. That exploring this, like when I throw this question at you, it's not because I'm trying to like really shake you up. I'm not trying to get you to be a moral skeptic or something like that. It's that I think the real goal here is authentic living, authentic choice, rather than this just going along with the flow sort of thing. That if morality matters, and I think it does, there's got to be some pretty deep reasons for why it matters, about what makes that valuable. There's a lot of interesting options here, and I'm not going to talk about some of the other options that different moral philosophers have offered in the history of moral philosophy tonight, because I kind of do want to ask you guys, and I don't want to spoil that question. Maybe some of you guys have read some moral philosophy and you might bring some of that stuff up, but I think it's an important question. It's a very important question. So maybe think about that on Tuesday, and then when we get back together on Wednesday, maybe we'll have a little bit of class discussion about that. So I'm going to sign off here. We'll leave it there. There's a lot of stuff tonight. Thanks for watching the extended version of the lecture. But we got through everything about Williams. And if you guys do have some questions, I'm happy to answer some. Do you, anyone in the chat tonight, have some questions that you guys want to ask? There wasn't a lot of interrupting tonight, so if there are some leftover things here, please let me know, and maybe we can slip them in here at the end of the lecture on the video. Anything you guys want clarified? Okay. All right. So it's making good sense. Can you guys give me a quick grade tonight? Like, were we moving too quickly to keep track of all the elements I was throwing out there, or did it go pretty good? Maybe grade me with a letter grade. Ah. Okay. Okay. So yeah, if there's some stuff like the YouTubers, you guys can always stop and rewatch the lecture and stuff like that. But for those of you who are in the chat tonight, if if like let things percolate a little bit, let them simmer, and if some questions start to emerge, definitely write them down, bring them to class. I'd like to clarify stuff. We did run through a good chunk of material pretty quickly. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. Thanks for your feedback, guys. And thanks for watching the video. I'll see you guys next time.